Hello everyone, Ben here, and welcome to our second party that we're going to cover. And this is part of our political movements and some realignment stuff that we've been covering. And we're going to be talking about the Republican Party today, the other major party, and the one that is currently in power. As we all remember, in 2016, the Republicans took control of both houses of Congress, or maintained control of both houses of Congress, and Donald Trump won the presidency, meaning the Republicans have control of both houses of Congress, as well as the executive branch, but they also were able to, in early 2017, appoint a conservative judge to replace Antonin Scalia, in the form of Neil Gorsuch, and therefore the court is slightly more conservative. I wouldn't call it controlled by conservatives, but it has been making some rulings in favor of conservatives. Anyway, so now time for a little bit of a history lesson. Yay, we love history. So the Republican Party formed officially in the early 1850s, but its seeds were planted in the election of 1824, which, interestingly enough, is when the Democrat Party was officially founded. So, as we all know, in the election of 1824, there were 4 candidates running, and they all were Democrat Republicans. But that didn't work out so well. As we all know, that one went to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams won, and Andrew Jackson was so pissed that he formed his own political party, the Democrats, and that party is still around today. In 1828, Quincy Adams ran for re-election as a national Republican, essentially which is not the same as today's Republican Party. And this National Republican Party was essentially a rebranded Federalist Party. So, for high tariffs, and was more of the industrial and slightly elite political party. They didn't last very long before they were replaced with the Whig Party, which was a collection of the anti-Jacksonian wing of the Democrat-Republican Party, the National Republicans, and just anyone who hated Andrew Jackson. And they were the ones who labeled Jackson as a jackass. Stubborn, crude, horrible. Modern rebirthing efforts for the Whig Party, so like every modern Whig Party has used the owl as their mascot, right? Well, the Republicans currently use the elephant. But the original Whig Party didn't have a mascot because they thought mascots were, a Jacksonian thing, and they were all about being anti-Jackson. Is this starting to sound familiar? But that was really the only thing that united the Whigs, and they were actually a very good opposition party for a time, but they started falling apart on the issue of slavery because, again, the only thing that really united the Whigs was anti-Jacksonian sentiment. And once Jackson was gone, they had to find something else, and that's when the party started to break apart. Yes, they got technically 4 presidents, but one they kicked out of the party, and the other was essentially a Whig in name only. And the other 2 died in office. Of course, we all know William Henry Harrison, Tippy Canoe. He was elected, and then he died in 30 days. He was replaced by John Tyler, and he was so unpopular amongst Whigs that he was kicked out of the party, and he finished his presidency as an independent. Yeah. And then they got, I believe it was Zachary Taylor as president, and he died in office. Who was he replaced by? If I remember correctly, it wasn't Pierce. Pierce was a lot. Wasn't Buchanan. Well, I don't know. It wasn't Polk. Who that? Whatever. You guys will tell me in the comments. I probably should look it up though. Anyway, I'm just having a brain fart at the moment. So anyway, around the 1850s, they started breaking apart over the issue of slavery, especially in the wake of the Dred Scott case. And Southern Whigs started, gravitating more towards the Democrat Party, as they were a lot more similar to the Democrats. And if it weren't for the fact that most of them just hated Jackson, they would have voted Democrat every single election anyway. And the Northern Whig Party kind of lost its way and couldn't really figure what it was doing, and they just broke up. And what happened was they split up and didn't really know what to do, and they all voted for James Buchanan, because who was going to vote with the Free Soil Party, which was essentially just the uber anti-slavery faction of the Whig Party, and this unknown candidate known as John Fremont in 1856. Well, as we all know, Buchanan won, and then he didn't run for re-election. He wasn't nominated by the Democrats to do so. And in 1860, by the way, in 1856, the Free Soil Party kind of also absorbed / nominated Fremont as well, and the Republican Party was officially formed in between, I think it was like in 1853 or something, or 1854. You guys will correct me, but it was formed in the early 1850s officially, and it was a single issue party. It was essentially the Free Soil Party merging with the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party as it was breaking up. And, well, let's just put it this way. They lost in 1856, but they made some good ground, and they were technically a third party at the time. They were a very new party, and again, they were single issue, opposed to slavery. And at first they were opposed to only the expansion of slavery. In 1860, they had their first presidential win. They won basically every single northern congressional seat and Senate seat in the years between 1856 and 1860, and they won even more in 1860. And of course, Abraham Lincoln being their first president. It was not as anti-slavery and as people want to believe. His abolition of slavery was merely a military strategy rather than a political one. He wanted to bring the South back into the Union, and the fastest way to do that was to abolish slavery in Southern-controlled territories. After his assassination, the Republican Party took on a much more radical position on both Reconstruction and civil rights. Maybe slightly too radical for some people, but they took it. Andrew Johnson was essentially a Democrat, and if I remember correctly, he was also kicked out of the Republican Party. he was also the first president to be impeached. So yeah, the Republicans, the radical Republicans in Congress, were the first group to impeach a president. And they did so over the issue of Andrew Johnson disagreeing with them. The Senate decided not to remove him from office or even convict him of whatever crimes Congress had drawn up against him, because they thought it would set a bad precedent to impeach a president and remove him from office simply because they disagreed with him. Which is actually, which also led to, which in my opinion is the reason why Clinton wasn't convicted in the Senate for perjury about the whole Monica Lewinsky thing, was because of this precedent. So good on you, Republican Party of old. Actually did something right. Moving on, they oversaw Reconstruction in a contentious election of 1872. The Supreme Court had to step in, and they awarded the election to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes. Or no, it wasn't Supreme Court, it was Congress agreed to give the election to Rutherford B. Hayes on a few conditions. Number one, he had only promised that he was going to run one term, but they said he would be allowed to win if he kept that promise. At least that's what some people claim. I'm not sure if he was actually going to do it regardless, but whatever. There were a few other things that were stipulated. The end of Reconstruction was the big one, though, why Democrats voted for Hayes to become president in the House of Representatives. And they maintained essentially complete control of the presidency, minus I think, minus four Democrat terms in the period between 1860 and 1932. They won essentially every presidential election, minus 4. And they had a chance, honestly, to win all but 2. The 2 they could have won were 1912 and 1916. The reason they lost in 1912 is because they were split over their progressive wing and the more establishment wing. And the progressive wing actually had split and supported Teddy Roosevelt in 1812. They had split to form their own, what's now called the Bull Moose Party, which I might do a short on that one. Which, honestly, the Bull Moose Party was just a cult of personality around Teddy Roosevelt. It's hard not to have a cult of personality around him. And the establishment wing supporting William Howard Taft. And the vote splitting more than likely led to Woodrow Wilson winning in 1912. And in 1916, the Republicans actually stood a very good chance of winning that one regardless. But if a Republican had won in 1912, it's likely that the presidency would have remained in Republican hands in 1916 as well, just because of the nature of American politics at the time. So after that, we go through the Roaring '20s, where we have Warren G. Harding, not William G. Harding, Warren G. Harding. He passes away due to a heart attack, and he is replaced by Calvin Coolidge, who is honestly kind of the mold and really the first truly conservative Republican to make it to actually become president. He's kind of the person people like Ronald Reagan could only have dreamed to become. And Calvin Coolidge did a lot of great things for the Republican Party. He oversaw one of the greatest economic booms, largely due to his policies. I won't go into why the Great Depression happened. That's a video for another time, and it's a much more complicated issue than a lot of people think. Because it deals with shit tons of cheap credit, the Federal Reserve, droughts in the Great Plains, and war reparations owed by Germany from World War I. And this was still a time when the Republican Party was still staunchly in favor of civil rights. In fact, Calvin Coolidge, he really pushed very hard for anti-lynching laws, to essentially make lynching a federal crime, but the Deep South pushed back against him. And no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't overcome that. He declined to run for a second term, and Herbert Hoover, who was essentially a war profiteer, he got the shaft for the Great Depression when it did occur. And even if the Democrats had won, the Democrat would have gotten the shaft too. It didn't matter who was in power. And honestly, if a Democrat was in power during the 1920s, I wouldn't blame them, even if I disagree with their economic policies, because the Great Depression wasn't the fault of any president or any economics policies, because it was a worldwide phenomenon. It hit places like the Soviet Union just as hard as it hit America. But moving on. So the Republican Party got absolutely slaughtered in 1932, thanks in part due to FDR having a bit of a cult of personality, but also cobbling together a coalition around his New Deal ideas and campaigning on that, as well as just anti-Republican sentiment because of the Great Depression. A knee-jerk reaction, but understandable given the economic climate. From there, they started making gains again in Congress, and actually by the end of the decade managed to take back one house, if I remember correctly. Maybe, maybe not. But they were having problems at the presidential level because of FDR. But by the end of World War II and the end of the 1940s, they had essentially recovered completely. Though some of their the more conservative wing of the party kind of got wiped out. And they kind of lost one of the largest voting bases during this time frame, and that was actually the African American voting base. Their first presidential win since 1928 came in 1952, when when Dwight Eisenhower beat, if I remember correctly, it was Adlai Stevenson by a landslide. And of course, Dwight Eisenhower was he was a moderate. Both parties actually approached him to try and get him to run under their banner. He chose the Republican Party, though I think he would have still won if he had chosen the Democrats. He was that popular. And he was, again, like I said, he was really, truly a moderate and an independent who just had a had the Republican R by his name, basically. And he oversaw one of the other economic booms of the 20th century in the form of whatever you want to call the 1950s. It was a great boom time, and he oversaw the nation. He helped develop the interstate highway system. And in his farewell address in 1960, he warned against the growing military-industrial complex, worried about letting it grow too large during the growing Cold War, right? Which was kind of a shock, because the Republican Party at this time had kind of taken on, I don't want to say a militaristic attitude, but they had taken up one of the key factors, one of the key features of the modern Republican Party, which is support of the military and support of troops, much more so than the Democrats. Not saying that the Democrats don't support our troops, I'm just saying the Republicans take it to whole new levels. They were the ones who were calling for an expanding military budget and an active hunt against communism at this time, though both parties despised communism and saw the Soviet Union as ideological enemies. 1960, they lost, with Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president, losing the election to John F. Kennedy. In 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson won the second consecutive term for the Democrats against Barry Goldwater, who was really a sign of things to come within the Republican Party. He is best described as what's sometimes called a paleoconservative, but he represented the growing conservative wing within the Republican Party. By 1968, Richard Nixon was able to band together this growing conservative vote and appeal to Southern conservatives, as well as maintain some moderate appeals to Republicans in the rest of the nation. And he was able to win in a landslide, partially, I would say, in thanks to George Wallace, but also partially on his own merit, as the Democrats nominated, I believe it was Hubert Humphrey, who just was kind of a flat candidate, to be honest. The next election, 1972, the Democrats nominated George McGovern, who was super far to the economic left in only one state of Massachusetts. And Nixon, of course, had that whole Watergate scandal around this time, which led to some massive unpopularity for both the Republican Party in general, but also himself and the person who eventually pardoned him, Gerald Ford, who people joke that Gerald Ford either falls down a lot or that he thinks democracy is overrated. Because he actually wasn't even elected to the vice presidency, and yet he became president because of he was appointed to the vice presidency to replace Spiro Agnew, who was impeached and removed due to, I believe it was corruption. Anyway, Jimmy Carter, of course, wins a narrow election in 1976, but gets slaughtered by Ronald Reagan, who kind of gave birth to the modern Republican Party. He took on an economically conservative tone, as well as, for the most part, a socially conservative tone. Though he supported a work visa program, as well as what would today be a more moderate stance on immigration. At the time, it was considered, let people come across the border, let them work, let them go back. Maybe in the early 2000s, it would have been considered the Democrat position on immigration. So the Republican Party definitely changed on that issue since. The flip could probably be seen in the mid-90s. Of course, the Republicans win 3 consecutive terms. Reagan won his re-election campaign in the largest electoral landslide in U.S. history, minus the George Washington unanimous stuff, and James Monroe essentially running unopposed. He won all but the District of Columbia and his opponent's home state of Minnesota, which he only lost by like 3,000 votes. George H.W. Bush won his term against Michael Dukakis, who looked really good in a tank. I'll give him that. Then, of course, H.W. gets crushed, sort of, by William Jefferson Clinton, as well as not really upholding his campaign promises, and a lot of people want to blame H. Ross Perot, but Ross Perot really didn't hurt H.W. as much as a lot of people want to believe. The RNC didn't support Bob Dole in 1996, instead trying to focus on congressional seats, which they didn't really do very well there. In the year 2000, H.W.'s son, George W. Bush, won election in a very contentious and controversial election. And he won re-election in 2004, and the Republicans lost in what could be described as a large defeat. I wouldn't quite call it a landslide, but it was approaching it in 2008. And in 2012, they lost again with Mitt Romney being the candidate. Some people will blame Romney not campaigning heavily during the final week of the election due to the belief that the polls couldn't change that much in a week. As well as a few controversial statements made by Mitt Romney, such as the whole binders full of women and the whole 47% comment. 2016, a lot of Republicans were worried about Donald Trump winning the nomination due to the belief that he would bring down the entire party. And we're essentially here to today. Trump is a fairly controversial figure in American politics. I'm not really going to try and talk about that controversy unless it's relevant, which it will be eventually. So let's talk about some of the Republicans' demographic strengths. They've started to make gains among non-college educated voters, especially white non-college educated voters who voted overwhelmingly for Trump as well as most Republicans. They also do well amongst white voters, though less so amongst college-educated whites. They do very well amongst rural voters, minus a few counties in the Deep South, which are predominantly African American. They do well with cultural conservatives. Economically liberal voters. Now, a lot of people are going to say, that's not true. I'm an economic liberal and I'm not a Republican. No, you're thinking economically liberal means they stand for free market capitalism, especially laissez-faire economic policy. And this is the economic definition of liberal. Okay? So, put your pitchforks and your torches down, people. Put your pitchforks and your torches down. They do well amongst people who hate unions. They do very well amongst older voters, and they do extremely well in the military, with Marines and Army service members as well as the veterans of those branches being the most Republican branches of the military. The Air Force and Navy less so. But the military tends to vote overwhelmingly Republican. Though there is a significant libertarian bend to the military, which is pretty interesting. I may actually talk about military, the political beliefs of many military folks. So let's talk about some of their demographic weaknesses. Of course, non-white voters and college-educated voters are big weaknesses, as well as urban voters, minus a few pockets like Orange County, Staten Island, and until the gubernatorial election of 2017, they did extremely well in Virginia Beach. So they do poorly amongst culturally liberal voters, and people who support economic collectiveness. So think New Deal voters, people who support universal health care, free college, that type of stuff. They do poorly amongst those types of voters. They don't do very well amongst younger voters. I'm talking about the younger voting demographic. The generation that comes after the millennials, we're yet to see where they lie on the political spectrum because it's very weird. And also we haven't seen them vote. And you have conflicting reports on who they voted for, who essentially middle and elementary school children as well as younger high school students voted for, any essentially school age kids. We have conflicting reports on who they voted for in their 2016 mock elections. With some people saying they voted overwhelmingly for Clinton and some people saying they voted overwhelmingly for Trump. We don't know, and we can't possibly know what the reality of the situation is. More than likely, and I'm going to stick by this belief, is that it was fairly split. It was evenly split. It just depended on where in the nation you were. They also don't do well amongst naturalized immigrants. They do better amongst some groups of naturalized immigrants. Think the Cuban population in Florida. Specifically outside of Miami, though Marco Rubio does fairly well there, but that's because he's also Cubano. They do fairly well amongst the Vietnamese population in the States. And I think there's one or two other Asian groups that vote fairly Republican. If I remember correctly, it's the Korean and Lao populations. But correct me if I'm wrong. And this is because a lot of people try and group people into larger demographics like Latino, Asian American, African American, that type of thing. When the truth is, especially with the Latino population, there are many different groups of Latinos. Are they Honduran? Are they Cubano? Are they Venezuelan? Are they Puerto Rican? Are they Mexican? Are they Colombian? Argentine? Chilean? And with the Asians, are they Japanese? Chinese? Korean? Vietnamese? Lao? Cambodian? Thai? But for the most part, naturalized citizens don't vote very Republican. Some of their political strengths, they've made gains in the Rust Belt, large gains, as well as a few gains in New England, but those could be seen as just weird quirks of the region where they like liberal Republicans as their governors. They've had some recent political victories in the forms of tax cuts, gun control. Heller Heller versus DC being the most notable case, though I believe the other major case was Chicago versus McDonald, which essentially overturned every state's ban on concealed carry permits, essentially requiring a state to allow their citizens to apply for one. We haven't gotten to see whether they'll do shall, or whether we haven't seen if there should be a distinct, whether it's okay to only have may issue or if it needs to be shall issue. They also have an electoral college advantage. Look at my video on the future margin spreadsheet, and you'll see the point I have in that they have an electoral college advantage. And part of that's because they still have the Deep South for now. That is kind of changing, and I agree that it is changing. It's just changing very slowly. Some of their political weaknesses include the religious right, because that kind of pushes them in a direction that a lot of the nation is starting to move away from. Even Republicans are starting to have issues with the religious right. The Republican Party is seen as a bit hawkish, and especially on the coasts, specifically New England, New York, the West Coast, they're seen as a bit backwards in terms of political and economic beliefs. Whether or not this is true, not up for me to decide. I'll leave that to the philosophers. The alt-right is also a major weakness for them because it makes it easy to associate all Republicans with that style of politics. And of course Donald Trump for, well, obvious reasons. Basically, he's a narcissistic asshole and people just don't want to be associated with him. So how can the Republicans become the best version of the Republican Party they possible? Well, we need to do for the Republicans what we did for the Democrats, which is try and make them the best moderate, which for the Democrats we need to make them the best moderate or center left-wing party they could be. And for the Republicans we need to make them the best center right-wing party they can be. And this is for the American center, not the world center, because world politics is much further to the economic left than American politics. So they need to stick to their guns on economic issues for the most part and not just campaign on them. So reduce spending, reduce taxes, and they actually need to do this, and that may include cuts to the military budget. Instead of just campaigning on them and then just throwing good money after bad on whatever frivolous military project they want. They need to also drop some of the less popular super conservative positions like the war on drugs and being anti-LGBT. Younger Republicans are very good about this. Speak to a college Republican and you'll get what I'm saying. Okay? Focus on presenting themselves as a positive for America. Essentially, improve your marketing. And you need to focus, and they also need to keep focusing on developing a bench at the state and local level like they did during the Obama years, where they cleaned house at the local level. And here's how they can win elections in the future. They need to run more diverse candidates like Tim Scott, Mia Love, Nikki Haley, and the rest. They need to condemn certain groups who think that the GOP aligns with them and explain why the GOP does not align with groups like, I don't know, the alt-right, the Klan, neo-Nazis, that type of thing. They need to just say, listen, they think we align with them, we really don't, and here's why. 1, blah, 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 blah. 2, blah, 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 blah. 3, blah, 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 blah. They need to continue to build their bench. It's okay not to have the presidency. if they can be an effective opposition party and get concessions from the Democrats if they don't control the White House. They need to run fewer attack dog candidates. Think Chris Christie type. They also need to stop running Trump-like candidates. And they need to appeal to the super-principled libertarian crowd. Essentially get more Rand Paul type candidates. And here's how they can lose more elections in the future. Copy the Trump campaign. If you need an explanation as to why this is a bad idea, look at Ed Gillespie's campaign in 2017. Do nothing but attack, attack, attack. Chris Christie. Keep bandying the religious right and super culturally conservative positions. Think Sheriff Joe Arpaio or Blankenship in West Virginia, or I don't know, anyone like that, really. They need to, if they also want to lose elections, they need to piss off their base by not holding up on their campaign promises when they actually get the power to change them like they did in 2016. This one is from the 2012 post-mortem the Republicans did, and they found that they need to appeal to the diversifying American demographic. And if they don't do this, they're going to continue to lose. They're going to lose elections. Not continue to, well, sort of continue to. But they will lose more and more elections if they don't. And if they don't even attempt to appeal to younger voters, at least on social issues, they're just dead in the water and shit out of luck. So that's kind of my breakdown of the Republican Party, how they can improve, how they can continue to win, elections, how they can lose elections, a little bit of history and background on the party, and some of their strengths and weaknesses. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Have a nice day. I'll see you guys next time. Tomorrow we're going to be doing an election prediction. This week I'm going to try and post this on Friday. I'm going to do a video on a potential political realignment in the United States and why it could be possible in the next, I'll say by 2030, we're going to see a political realignment. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope you had a nice day. I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy. Bye.